Hello, thank you all for joining me for today's conversation on the Excellence in Assessment designation. I'm Janina Baker, the Assistant Director at the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, or NALOA, and I help lead the process that surrounds the Excellence in Assessment designation, or as we like to call it here, the EIA. Obviously, this is a recording and it will be posted on our website in case you would like to come back to it as you're ready to digest some of the information that's shared today. So today we're just going to have a few pieces that we discuss here. So we'll start with what is the Excellence in Assessment designation and give you some information on how your institution can apply, what all the application entails, as well as the review process. So I hope that you'll find this useful and interesting. And if you have questions, I'll post my email address at the end that I hope and invite you to continue to have a conversation with us. We won't cover the really in-depth pieces of how the EIA process got started. If you are interested in that, I invite you to look on our website and I'll show you where you might find that information, where Terry Hines and Natasha Jankowski were able to really get into the beginning pieces of framing why such a process and designation was needed. However, I will start here. What is the Excellence in Assessment designation? As you can see right there, it's one of the first national recognitions for institution level assessment. We definitely are not in this alone. We have a few partners, both AAC&U as well as VSA Analytics, that join us in this work and continue to promote and release information as needed around the designation itself. We also have one endorser currently, the Council of Independent Colleges, that has signed on, and if you're interested, if your organization is interested in endorsing, please also contact us, and we'd love to have more conversations around that. But to get started, just a little bit into the designation, at NALOA, we recognize that doing good integrated assessment is only half the job. And our partners came in on this conversation and said, we need to be better at communicating what we're doing, how we're supporting assessment on our campuses, and what it means to all of our stakeholders. We found that even those campuses that are engaged in intentionally aligning assessment of student learning often struggle to tell their stories to the variety of stakeholders that they are accountable to. While most institutions now make a practice of publicly stating what their learning outcomes are, we've seen that through our national survey results, they generally share assessment findings internally and frequently only to faculty or assessment committees. Rarely are assessment plans or rationales shared, even with students or alums, much less with external stakeholders, such as employers, transfer institutions, state legislators, or just the general public. Put another way, institutions talk about assessment often to themselves, if and when they talk about it at all. In keeping with the original vision of the voluntary system of accountability, now VSA Analytics, to help institutions better tell their stories, the EIA designation used a rubric that was developed from the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, or NALOA's, Transparency Framework, to evaluate campus applications. So wanting to create intentional focus on communicating assessment processes and results. And of course, we'll discuss that more later. Before we go on much further, I do want to at least let you know that all the information that I share here can be found on this website. If you go to NALOA's website, look under our work, and then look under transparency, you'll find the Excellence in Assessment designation information. Not only will you find the application packet, you'll also find the rubric, important deadlines, and information on past designees. Many of who I'm sure you'll recognize the institutions themselves, as well as the reviewers, our national assessment experts that we rely heavily on, and additional resources. And it's under those additional resources that you'll find that very first webinar that Terry Hines, who definitely was instrumental in the development and the implementation of the EIA designation process and application as well as Natasha Jankowski led. And so that will definitely give you more insight into the beginnings of the EIA. And much of the information can also be found in the application packet. So to start us out and to help frame where you think you might be in terms of thinking about communication and transparency around learning outcomes assessment. I offer up this continuum. And at the 2019 AACNU annual meeting, Dr. Jillian Kinsey, who is one of our NOLOA senior scholars, put forward this continuum for institutions to think about how they are currently communicating assessment of student learning to its audiences. And as we talk through this, I invite you to think about where your own institution falls and then begin thinking about how strategies, pretty specifically, right, the EIA designation, and maybe some others that that you might be engaged with, can help your institution move to the right. So this first stage, I think it's pretty self-explanatory, right? It's one of compliance, where you post your outcomes and you select results. Most likely those are that are favorable to your institution, right? When we look at the next stage, which I think it's a nice way to frame this continuum. Next stage is where institutions overshare and flood their institution with data that's easy to measure, just to show that they're doing something, right? If we continue to follow to the right, what comes next is a much more measured or tailored approach, where institutions begin to think about audience and the purpose of where they're communicating the information. If you keep moving, is where institutions begin to really take stock of what's happening at their institution and where learning is taking place, both in and out of the classroom, hopefully to provide a more complete picture of student learning. And furthest to the right, what we're seeing right now is as stated, right? A nuanced, tailored framework for communicating outcomes, improvements in a comprehensive, student-focused, culturally responsive way. Overall, what you see from the left to the right is the shift of an institution just needing something to communicating to that of an institution using frameworks to guide its communications processes. We often see and find institutions here. So if you do find yourself here, you're not alone. There's definitely a lot of work, really good work still to do around communicating and thinking about transparency, especially in regards to assessment. And so hopefully as you work through the EIA process, you start to see how using the framework or one or more, right, help you in this quest of transparency. I think that you can find that we, the three sponsoring organizations, believe that the EIA designation assists with this. And that particularly is developing a cohesive narrative that assists institutions in communicating what's happening around student learning. So what does the application actually consist of? I think first off, it's important to note that this is an electronic application. You don't mail anything to us. It's all via email, and we've had some creative ways in doing that. The email address is actually located in the application packet itself. So if you're trying to find where to send it to, make sure you look through there, as well as the website. That said, if you submit your application and do not receive a confirmation, please don't hesitate to contact us. We want you to ensure that your application will go through the review process. The application itself starts with the first 3 bullet points on this slide. So the first is a letter from senior leadership. That could be your president, your chancellor, provost. It states why the institution has decided to pursue the EIA designation. This letter is the introduction to your institution's application and should be no more than 2 pages. The letter should provide an overview of your institution's submission for the EIA designation, including any highlights you wish to emphasize in your application. It is important to note here, though, that the letter is not scored as part of the application, but very important as reviewers go through the narrative itself. Second, in that bullet point is a completed institutional context form. This is also not scored, but definitely needed should you receive the designation, as this provides us with information on key contacts for the decision as the decision is made, as well as who in your communications or marketing departments should be in the contact for when as we roll out press kits and other information to publicly announce the designation. Third is an annotated list of individuals and groups that are engaged in assessment activities across the institution. This could be assessment councils or committees at the college program department and or unit level. And we hope that you provide some brief descriptions of the charge of each group as it relates to assessment. Note that these individuals and groups are not required to participate in the creation of the application, but rather are intended to help reviewers better understand the structure of assessment processes and should be no more than 2 pages. This brief overview can also serve as a reference document within the narrative, so you don't have to keep explaining the function of each group in the content of the application. You can really use that word count wisely. If you do desire, you can decide to include an appendix as the annotated list. So definitely talk through and work through that process with your team that's engaging in this application process. Moving to the narrative itself, I think just to start, many institutions engage in this work thinking of it as just an institutional self-study, right, of its assessment process. Some have then turned that into us and sent that in and said, we want to receive formative feedback on what we're doing on our assessment practices here at our institution. So definitely consider this as developmental in that sense that we want you to get some good feedback, whether you're early on in the assessment process or very mature. I think that you'll find the feedback that if you hear from institutions that talk about the feedback that they've been given are very appreciative and definitely help them move to their next steps. So depending on where you are in your assessment process, I would say still go through the application and the rubric and see and start to write and start to think about where you are in the process, and then consider actually sending that in to us and getting some more formal feedback from our reviewers. The narrative process itself, the narrative itself is between 2,000 and no more than 3,000 words. Tables and figures are included in this narrative count towards that 3,000 word limit. However, the word count does not include items 1 through 3, those bullets that are listed up at the top. Here, really take some time, right? The narrative should be written to an audience of higher education peers who are not familiar with the applying institution's context or assessment processes and approaches. However, you can assume that there's basic familiarity with higher education assessment, accreditation, and accountability concepts, right? We want you, in something that's occurred over the years that we didn't initially include, is now this introduction to the context, philosophy, and their history behind your assessment approach. I think this introduction is very useful to the application, specifically on why the institution assesses student learning and how you've ended up with your current process. A lot of us have institutional history and knowledge of things that we've tried before. That can help us clarify why assessment is undertaken, but why it also unfolds in the unique way it does at the institution. So really taking some time to think about what that context is, right? And putting that out to the reviewer so that they can understand why you're doing what you're doing and not something else. The application itself within the rest of the narrative should address the 8 domains that we'll discuss here shortly, as viewed from the perspective of institution-wide assessment of student learning outcomes. 6 of these domains that I'll speak of draw heavily on the components of the LOI Transparency Framework, and the reflection growth piece we'll discuss here shortly as well. Just a few important notes here before we move on. So it's not a requirement that each domain that I spell out be given equal space. You and your institution decides the best use and formatting of this information. You might also include links to additional information that's online or provide appendices that you reference within your narrative if you feel that the information contained cannot be succinctly summarized or described. Reviewers are asked to read the material on the links or appendices only as noted in the application narrative components. However, I think it's important that you all know that reviewers will be required to visit no more than 3 links in any section. So again, if it's not 3 links for the entire narrative, but 3 links for each section of the narrative, reviewers are required to visit no more than that. Another note, applicants should make every attempt to include all pertinent information in their narrative. Please don't attach forms, templates, reports, screenshots of information in lieu of describing the process for and functions of integrated assessment activities at your institution. That narrative element of the EIA places an emphasis on why particular processes are utilized, as well as the actions that result from it. The application narrative is designed to help you clearly and succinctly explain why you do or you do not do and are engaged in certain activities when it comes to institution-wide assessment of student learning. Again, the links should be supportive of the narrative, not take away from or be offered up instead of the narrative. And here, definitely emphasize to not use bullet points, right? We want narrative. We want to really hear your story and have you spell out why it is that you're doing what you're doing. Also, institutions should provide a coherent narrative that addresses each of the criteria domains. Make sure that they're clearly labeled in your application, because the overall purpose is to write a narrative of your assessment process to those that are not familiar with the institution or its culture. So I think after all this, you might be asking yourself, do we add an appendix? Do we add links? I think that links to resources or evidence are generally more useful and allow you to add context to a fluid web page after submission is needed. However, an appendix is often more static, meaning you can't add more to it between submission and review. So definitely just consider those as you're going through your narrative itself. And we'll talk a little bit more about the evaluation by national assessment experts as we get to the review section. But definitely, we appreciate our reviewers. They are amazing and very knowledgeable of assessment, different models, practices, and I think provides some excellent feedback. As you think about the excellence in assessment process, hopefully, if you've read anything about it, you've noticed that there's 2 award levels. We have both excellence and sustained excellence. Excellence is almost the intro designation to those that are doing really good work at the institutional level. For those institutions who have been engaged in assessment for longer than 5 years, the sustained excellence designation is something that is potentially achievable for them. And so there have been some institutions that have received this designation itself. So I definitely want to emphasize that piece, especially for those institutions that are much more mature in their assessment process. That might be something to go after. Definitely have to spell that out in your narrative to ensure that you've been doing it longer than 5 years. And those institutions that have done that, that have received this designation, have absolutely done that. The designation itself is open to any accredited degree granting institution. Here, I'll just note that it's not a college within a college that can apply. It has to be the institution itself. We have had that question quite a bit, and we want to ensure that this is an institution level assessment designation, not a college, specifically within a college. That said, what does institutional level assessment look like, right? It's both vertically and horizontal. So vertical, right, it builds from classroom engagement and up, right? And then horizontal, it's very intentionally inclusive of student affairs, external stakeholders, right? It's not just what's happening in the classroom. Perhaps a better picture is this graphic also that's in the application packet, right? We ideally want scaffolding of learning outcomes that occur across courses, programs, and co-curricular experiences, such that assessment work from an individual course or learning experience can link to and inform the assessment work of a program. This scaffolding allows for fewer assessment activities to occur at higher levels of the pyramid than at lower levels. The evidence that's built from beneath definitely and hopefully serves to support the evidence that's provided at the top. It's definitely, I think, a nice graphic for thinking about integrated institution-wide assessment. So I've cited the LOI Transparency Framework a few times throughout this conversation, and I wanted to come back to it for those who are not as familiar with it. NOLA created this transparency framework to help institutions evaluate the extent to which they are making evidence of student accomplishment readily accessible and potentially useful and meaningful to various audiences. Based on a national review of institutional assessment websites, the transparency framework consists of 6 components centered around a set of underlying principles common to all of the components. Hopefully, if you've not seen it before, you can use this framework, and many institutions have used it, to examine their own institutional websites, right? And I think that this has been a valuable process, right, in thinking about what is needed, especially as you're thinking in terms of transparency and assessment to a variety of stakeholders. So to better help understand this connection between the framework and the designation itself, I'll go through each of these 6 components: learning outcome statements, assessment plans, etc., so that you might think about the connection between, and then think about further some evidence that you might have on your own campus to help supply within each of those. But first, I want to just at least draw some attention to the central tenets of the framework. And these are the pieces that we're talking about that are common to all of those components. I do want to make mention, while I did not participate in the scanning of institutional websites, Natasha Jankowski, our director, certainly did. And through scan, her and a few of the other colleagues looked through over 3,000 plus websites and help to come up with these central tenets. So clarity, right? There's no jargon involved in that, and that they're just clearly worded in terms of what that means, right? That they're easy to find, that they're updated regularly, and the pieces are timely. So I want to make sure that at least when you're seeing and thinking about these components, this is definitely something that ties them all together. So let's start with student learning outcome statements. Hope that you've been thinking about, as I have been talking, right, what are reviewers looking for? And the sponsoring organizations actually developed some guiding questions to assist institutions working to write their narratives to capture evidence in each of the domain areas. And as these are what the reviewers are looking for, evidence of, and will score that using the associated rubric that I hope that you will find on our website. Don't worry, you don't need to write all these questions down. They're definitely located in the application packet. It's on the website. These guiding questions are strongly linked with the scoring rubric. Hopefully assists institutions in addressing the breadth and depth of your assessment activities in your response. Again, I just want to remind you're not required to respond explicitly and separately to each question. These are definitely just posted as guiding questions as you reflect and provide evidence of each. So specific to student learning outcome statements, they clearly state the expected knowledge, skills, attitudes, competencies, and or habits of mind that students are expected to acquire at an institution. For the purposes of this EIA designation, reviewers are looking for evidence that student learning outcome statements are integrated with co-curricular, college, program, unit, and course levels. Definitely pretty much that they're infused throughout educational design, right? In the assessment plans section, institution level plans for gathering evidence of student learning might include institution-wide approaches that convey how student learning will be assessed, the data collection tools and approaches that will be used, and the timeline for implementation. Such plans may build on the work from program level and unit level plans, but should represent some level of common assessment activities designed to provide evidence of the learning throughout the institution. For the purposes of the EIA designation, reviewers are looking for evidence that the assessment plans across the institution are intentionally integrated or scaffolded, especially between and among academic and student affairs. Assessment resources encompasses information or training provided to faculty, students, and staff to help them understand and develop and implement and communicate and use the evidence of student learning. Here, reviewers are looking for evidence of a centralized location where faculty and staff locate resources on assessment best practices, and includes information on institution level assessment activities, how those are integrated with program, unit, and course assessment. In addition, and this is a really important note here, right? They're looking for evidence of policy and procedures for evaluating faculty and staff, which might include formal or official supports and or recognition of efforts that are made to improve or advance assessment practices, either individually, within a program, or at the institution level. Definitely information that we seek. We're definitely looking for institutions that are doing exactly that, right? Acknowledging in the promotion and tenure process and policies, right? We're definitely seeking institutions with that. So please write about it if you do have that. As for current assessment activities, this includes information on the full range of projects and activities recently completed or currently underway to help gauge institution level student learning, make improvements, or even respond to accountability interests. In this component, and for the purposes of the EIA designation, reviewers are looking to see that information on current assessment activities is easily accessible to various audiences, both on and off campus, and includes information on how institution level assessment activities integrate again with program, unit, and course assessment. Again, thinking about that pyramid and integrated institution level assessment. As we move to the fifth component, evidence of student learning, this includes results of institution level assessment activities, may include evidence of indirect, such as surveys, and direct evidence like portfolios, student learning, looking at evidence of indirect and direct student learning, as well as institutional performance indicators such as licensure pass rates. For the purposes of the designation, reviewers here are looking for evidence of how the institution connects the dots between the multiple layers of assessment activities that occur within programs, units, courses, and various other learning experiences, right? Both those inside and outside of the classroom, to provide an integrated picture of student learning, much of what we're talking about when we think about that continuum at the beginning of our conversation. And this final component, one of the most difficult to really get at, use of student learning evidence. This particular component represents the extent to which institution-level evidence of student learning is used to identify areas where changes in policies and practices may lead to improvement, inform institutional decision-making, problem identification, planning, goal setting, faculty development, course revision, program review, and accountability or accreditation self-study, right? Could be 1, 2, 3, all of those, right? Here, and especially for the purposes of the EIA designation, reviewers are looking for evidence from multiple levels to guide programmatic and curricular decision-making, as well as monitor and evaluate the results of those decisions for improvements in learning. This is definitely one of the hardest categories to provide evidence of, and as such is weighted heavier on the rubric. And the last domain is around reflection and growth. And even institutions that excel at using assessment results to inform and guide their decision-making have room for improvement. In this final narrative component of the EIA application, reviewers are looking forward to reading reflections and revelations made by your application team in the process of completing your application, and reflecting on the overall quality and robustness of your institutional assessment system and use of assessment data. Through the identification of concrete steps you plan to take in the next 3 years to grow or improve your institutional use or integration of institutional assessment results, reviewers definitely enjoy reading this, and a lot of weight is also put here in how, and as reviewers really look for some meat, right? Think that not glossing over this section is extremely important, and really spending some time reflecting on your challenges as well as your strengths will go a long way. So just a piece of advice here. As you think about the reviewing process, right, you prepared your entire application, and you know what happens with that application itself. There's a few pieces to this, and again, your application hopefully is completed via a self-study by the institution. One thing that we found at the very beginning and that we expected was that there'd be a large and diverse campus application team that engaged in the self-study process that we felt was best to aid campuses in preparing their designation application narrative. I think at the beginning, there's an acknowledgement that we placed too much emphasis on representation within an application team without addressing the true intent of this, right? That a broad and diverse group of institutional committees and individuals are actively and substantively engaged in ongoing assessment activities. So we definitely altered those guidelines to make it clear that while an ideal institutional assessment plan will be inclusive of a broad and diverse set of constituents, it is not a requirement that all of those parties engage directly in creating this narrative. We definitely do want to encourage the team, though, to that's charged with crafting this application narrative to be inclusive of various audiences in substantive way. I think that that's definitely the expectation in this as we've continued to improve the application process. And I think this expectation is an intentional effort to address a barrier to integrated approaches to assessment, that only one office or a few individuals are in charge of and responsible for supporting the entire enterprise of assessment on its campus. So hopefully by using this application process as a means to think collectively about your institution and about strategies to better address areas of disconnect can be a very strong use of the application process itself. As for the faculty experts, we have a panel of assessment experts from around the country that review and score each application. We have at least 2 reviewers that read each submission, and reviewers use the scoring rubric that's available on the EIA website to evaluate those submissions. The rubric scoring is based off of evidence that's provided in your narrative. Applications are reviewed holistically prior to scoring by expert reviewers. I do want to make note that the minimum score for consideration of being awarded an EIA designation is 72. However, meeting that minimum overall score does not guarantee receipt of a designation. Following the individual scoring of the rubric, reviewers collectively discuss the application and make an overall recommendation for whether the institution should receive the designation. Institutions who are recommended for the designation will then be considered by the reviewers for the sustained designation, based on whether evidence was provided that the institution has been engaged in meaningful institution-wide assessment practices for at least the last 5 years. In other words, sustained designations are determined holistically after all other criteria have been rated. Reviewer recommendations will be taken into consideration, and the final decision will be made in consultation with the reviewers and staff of the sponsoring groups and associations. Once the decision has been made, all institutions will receive constructive feedback, as well as resources that reviewers determine will help them move their assessment practice. Each application is reviewed on the basis of its own merits and is not considered in comparison to other applications received or reviewed. There is neither a minimum nor a maximum number of EIA designations that may be made in a given year. We often get asked that question. There's perhaps between 20 and 40 applications that have been submitted annually, depends on definitely on the year. And we might have 12 designees, we might have 2. It definitely just depends on the strength of the application itself. As for the timeline, the dates are on your screen. If you're interested in applying for this upcoming year, all applications are due May 1st of 2020 to the website that is, to the email address that's located on our website and the application packet. All those that submitted an application will be notified of their results by July 31st, 2020. That said, the embargoed means that it's just not publicly released, because we wait for the public announcement of that for August 19th. We want to make sure our sponsoring and endorsed organizations are on board, everyone receives the same information, media is notified, and we definitely want everyone to celebrate the public announcement that coincides with our August release of the NOLOA newsletter. We also want to at least acknowledge a mentoring opportunity that has taken place the past few years at the Assessment Institute. This year, it's happening October 25th through 27th, 2020 in Indianapolis. Here, institutions that are seriously considering applying for the next year have the opportunity to meet with institutions that have received the designation, as well as reviewers who definitely provide some really good insight as institutions are thinking about whether they should or shouldn't do it and thinking about next steps. So definitely consider that, mark that on your calendars if you're interested. And as we're about to celebrate some of our designees this week, we always in January at the AAC&U annual meeting, since the beginning of the Excellence in Assessment designation, honor the designees at a reception during that time. So in January 2021 is when we'll honor this next year's recipients. Here, I just want to make note that there are many lessons to be learned, and institutions have definitely thought through and reflected on not only the process itself, but even further, where they want to go with next steps. Every January, February edition of Assessment Update, and the designees are invited to write up a reflection on the process and just thinking about what EIA has meant to them in their campus. So if you're interested in hearing more from the institutions themselves, I invite you to read through that, each of those editions. It's been since the very beginning that the designation was created. So I hope that you'll go back and look through that. We're coming upon the next, this year's designees that I've written this past year. So that edition should be out soon. I definitely invite you to read that. Definitely some really good lessons to learn as you're going upon your own practice of writing the application itself and thinking through the process. So overall, the EIA designation, I'd like to think, assists institutions struggling to address transparency and communication of its assessment efforts. What we have seen is that more information is not always better, right? We have to help our stakeholders make sense of what the evidence means for the institution and student learning. Again, not just giving links and giving bullets, but think about, again, of that continuum that was near the beginning of this conversation, right? Where there's narrative, instead of sporadic, spontaneous assessment approaches, right? We want them to be regular and substantive. So when you're thinking of the narrative, right, how do we communicate and convey what's happening on our campus? How do we use evidence to help tell that story, right? In terms of communication and transparency. Lastly, as we wrap up, I definitely want you to think just about the designation itself. And we hope that it brings together the current state of the art of learning outcomes assessment with shifts in the field of transparency of student learning. Its function is to provide examples to the field, but also to help institutions tell a coherent story of their assessment processes and practices in a comprehensive, student-focused, culturally responsive way, as so eloquently described by Dr. Kinsey. To wrap up, I want to just show you slides of some of our designees. Perhaps your own institution is a part of that. I think of a distinguished group, and we are honoring this group here shortly this year, our 2018 designees, as well as our 2017 and 2016. We have over 27 institutions that have now been awarded either the excellence or sustained excellence designation. So thank you for joining me today. And again, if you have questions, here's my email address. Again, I invite you to peruse the website for more information. If you have questions, email me. If you want more information about the EIA and how it was started, I again invite you to look at that very initial webinar on the website that was conducted by Terry Hines and Natasha Jankowski. But I thank you for your time today, and I hope your assessment processes continue to improve. Thank you.